Hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And I know what many of you are thinking, I haven't really uploaded for over a year, but hopefully from now on, every week there will be a new video on my YouTube channel, so there will be plenty of new content coming in the future. Now let's celebrate the comeback of this YouTube channel with a free preview of my newest course, which is Security Plus Certification Bootcamp. Now this course is currently available on zerotomastery.io, link will be in the description, and this course is specifically designed to help you prepare for the Security Plus certification exam. Now it will cover all the topics that are required or that you need to know for the exam. It will cover them in details, and it will also provide you a cheat sheet which will help you memorize all the important acronyms regarding the Security Plus topics. Now, in this specific video, we will give a free preview of the first couple sections right here, just so you get the basic idea of how the course is structured and what do the lectures look like, and then you can decide whether that fits your way of learning or if it doesn't. Now, of course, if there is any questions regarding the certificate or regarding any topic that you might have, feel free to post them in the comment section below the video and I will happily respond to each and every question. Nonetheless, let's not waste any more time and let's get straight into this free preview of the Security Plus Certification Bootcamp. See you in the course. Hello and welcome to the Zero to Mastery's brand new course on security. Now, I think it's important that right at the start we mention what will be the main focus for this course. So let's say it straight away. In this course, we will be specifically focusing on the Security Plus curriculum and the scope of the exam. Now, Security Plus exam is a certification exam that focuses on best security practices, risk management, mitigation, and many other things besides that. As many of you probably already know, this is an entry-level exam for security, which, once successfully passed, offers a certificate widely accepted and respected. Here at ZTM, we will provide you with videos regarding the steps needed in order to prepare for this exam. Now, it's important that we mention at the start that for the absolute beginners, this will not be an easy task, but with enough dedication and will to learn new things, and with the help of this course, you will be prepared to take the exam and dive deep into the world of security and technology. We will make this easier by separating the course into several different subjects that are covered by the Security Plus exam. Each of these subjects is focused on specific topics, and at the end of every subject, we will have a small test of knowledge with few questions provided that you can use to practice what you learned. So let's not make this introduction any longer and let's start our path of absolute beginners on our journey to become Security Plus certified. See you in the next lecture where we will discuss what exactly does the Security Plus exam cover, and we will also be discussing why it is an important certificate to have and what positions require this certificate. Okay, so we made our introduction and you have decided that you want to get your hands on this certificate. What's next? Well, we need to first discuss what are the goals of learning the topics needed for this certificate. After finishing this course, you should be familiar with basics of security, as well as being able to assess the security posture of an enterprise environment and recommend and implement appropriate security solutions. You will also be able to provide solutions for monitoring and securing hybrid environments, including cloud, mobile, and Internet of Things devices. You will be able to operate with an awareness of applicable laws and policies, including principle of governance, risk, and compliance. And once you cover all the topics, you should be able to identify, analyze, and respond to security events and incidents. Now, these would be the ultimate goals. Of course, it will take lots of practice, but we can do it. Now, besides this, you're probably also wondering, well, why would I take this exam at all? what positions can I apply for, or what positions even require this certificate. This being an entry-level security exam, it is required by many entry-level security positions such as systems administrator, security specialist, security engineer, network administrator, and many more. So, as you can see, there are quite a few positions requiring this exam, and matter of fact, you won't mistake taking Security Plus for whichever security position or career path you decide to go for. It will even be useful in case you do not go into security at all. Okay, but what else is important? Well, let's also mention which topics exactly are being covered with Security Plus. Truth is, there are many, and here is a list of some of the topics that we will talk about. These topics include access control, authentication, secure network design, secure and unsecure protocols, implementing wireless and mobile security as well as cloud security, risk management, cryptography and public key infrastructure, and many more things besides this. So what you see here listed are definitely not all the topics that we will talk about. However, these are considered among the more important topics. Now, another important thing to note is that all of these topics are not equally seen at the exam. Matter of fact, CompTIA created a list of 5 subjects that occur on the exam. They combined all of these topics that we mentioned into 5 major subjects, and they also provided us with percentage of questions that you can expect from each and every topic. But before we mention those, let me tell you about some other basic details of the exam that you should know of. So the exam itself consists of maximum 90 questions. The time that you have to complete all of these questions will also be 90 minutes, and scoring is based on a scale of 100 to 900, where getting 750 or more will be a passing score. Now, CompTIA also recommends 2 years of work experience in IT administration with focus on security, but this is not really necessary as you can pass the exam without any experience whatsoever. It will be a plus though if you had an IT job before and if that job had a focus or had at least some aspects of security involved in it. But if you didn't, don't worry, we will cover everything in the course. Now that we mentioned that, let's see how CompTIA organized the topics and what percentage of occurrence does each topic have. As I mentioned before, all the topics that we listed previously, CompTIA combined into 5 major sections that are attacks, threats, and vulnerabilities, with 24% of question occurrence on the exam. We got architecture and design with 21% question occurrence. We got implementation with 25%. We have operations and incident response with 16%, and we have governance, risk, and compliance with 14%. Okay, awesome. This would be all the important information that you should know for now. We mentioned what are the goals of the Security Plus exam. We also mentioned which roles can require a Security Plus certificate. We listed some of the topics that will be covered inside this course, and we talked about the basic information of the Security Plus exam, such as the amount of questions, its length, and which topics will be seen in the exam, as well as their percentages. Now that we got that out of the way, let's go straight into security basics and the concept of CIA triangle. See you in the next lecture. Okay. Before we continue, let me quickly first talk about how you should approach this course. Now, while this course will cover all the topics that are on the Security Plus exam, you do not want to limit yourself just to the information that you get from this course. Usually, combining this with a little bit of Googling on different definitions and concepts that we cover will give you the best understanding of what to expect on the exam. Now, besides this, when it comes to learning, there is one thing that might be boring but necessary, especially for this certificate, and those are acronyms. There are lots of Security Plus acronyms that you should be familiar with. You should know what they mean, and you should know their simple descriptions. And while we will cover almost all of them inside the course, it is good to have a list of all the acronyms besides you so you can learn them step by step. I will show you a good source of acronyms in just a second, but let me first also mention the structure of the course. The structure of the course is not really that important. If you feel like learning certain topic before the other one, you can do that. If you know a certain topic and you're confident you do not need to watch it, feel free to skip that topic and go to the next one. Most of the topics are tied together, so they do interfere with one another, but learning all of them is the crucial part and crucial step to successfully passing the exam. We know that there are 5 official topics when it comes to Security Plus, but in this course we divided them into several more topics just for the easier understanding. Now that we got that out of the way, let me show you where you can take a look at that acronyms list for Security Plus, which you might find useful. Okay, this is the acronyms list that I was talking about, and you can find this list at this link right here, getcertified.ecpi.edu. Now, the full link will be in the resource file of this course, so no worries, you do not need to paste it letter by letter from this lecture. You can just go to the resource list that we provided with this course and you will find this link right there. Now, the acronyms list itself is quite a large one. This is just the start and there are 4 large pages to this list. You should be familiar with all of these acronyms, or at least with vast majority of them. There are some that will most likely not appear on the course, however, you do want to know all of them to be sure that you can pass the exam, since on the exam the occurrence of acronyms is quite large. For example, let's take this AAA acronym, which means authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, on the question itself, or in the answers provided for the question, you might not see the full definition, which is authentication, authorization, and accounting. The answer to the question might be specified just as AAA. So, unless you know what AAA means, you will not be able to fully understand the question or give an answer to that question. That's why knowing acronyms is quite important. Now, the easiest way that you can approach this is have this list by your side every time that you're learning, and every day, for example, make sure that you learn at least 10 to 20 new acronyms, which you can repeat throughout the day in order to remember them. Okay, so that would be about it regarding the acronyms. Once again, this link will be in the resource file of the lecture and of the course itself, and make sure that you do read these acronyms and that you do learn them before taking the exam. Nonetheless, thank you for watching and I will see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome back. Before we even dive into any of the actual Security Plus topics, let's quickly mention some of the basic stuff when it comes to cybersecurity and some of the basic concepts that you will hear a lot in this industry and that you should also be familiar with. So first and foremost is the CIA concept triangle. Now, this might not be the CIA that you are thinking of, since it has nothing to do with Central Intelligence, but it does have everything to do with IT security. CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, these 3 concepts are important when it comes to security. Let's talk about each of these 3 one by one. Confidentiality is there to make sure that only the authorized people or devices have access to certain information or data. Access to this data should be granted only to those who are supposed to know the content of the data or the information. For example, your bank account information, transactions, and access is only available to you and your bank over your bank's application. If someone else was to get the same access to your bank account, it would be a breach of confidentiality. Okay, next one, we have integrity, and the goal of integrity is to make sure that data or information that's being sent is not being changed or manipulated. Let's say you and I want to exchange data over network. Now, if we do not take proper measures of encrypting the communication, an attacker could intercept that data, switch or change it, and then forward it back to you. That would be breach of integrity. Now, one of the things that we use to make sure that integrity was not breached is called hashing. Now, hashing is a process of taking the data and converting it to something completely different. So even if someone was to alter the data, just by checking the original data and the hash value that arrived to the destination, we can conclude if that data was manipulated. Now, some of the more known hashing algorithms are SHA-1 and MD5, but we will talk more about them later throughout the course. And last but not least, we have availability. Now, availability makes sure that data and information that we need to access are always available. Imagine if your bank account was not available over application every 2 hours because the application was, let's say, under maintenance or it was down for whatever reason. You would change your bank in no time, right? Well, that is why availability is important. Usually, this is solved by multiple servers having access to the same data, so if one was to go down for whatever reason, the other ones would still work and the data will be accessible to the authorized users. Now, more about this as well we will talk about in the incident response and prevention lectures. Okay, so this would be the CIA triangle. Make sure to remember it as you will be hearing about it all the time on your security path. Besides this, we also have some other basic important terms that we should be familiar with, such as the least privilege concept or principle of least privilege. The meaning behind it is that we should always give the least or smallest possible amount of access to someone, just enough so that they could do their job. For example, there is no need for a regular employee in a company to have access to administrator privileges on their account if they do not need them for their job. Giving employees more privilege than they will need will always be a security problem, and that's why giving them just enough privilege to do their task is the proper way to go. Different companies will write their own least privilege rulebook or policy so that the administrators will know how to operate with other accounts and their access. Another important term that you might come across is detailed defense mechanism. Now, the purpose of detailed defense mechanism is to protect a company or facility or pretty much anything with layered defense system. This means that if one layer of defense is breached, there will be several others to still protect. Let's take a look at an example of a company that has several layers of protection. Now, first we have the company building, right? So the physical layers are the first layers of security that you usually encounter when, let's say, trying to enter a company building. The reason is because in the company building, there will be all the employees, servers, devices, and the important data. So the obvious layer that any company will have is the physical security layer. And to this physical security layer, we also have sublayers such as having fence around the company, then having CCTV cameras recording both outside and inside of the company, while also being guarded by guards at each entrance. The important servers and data should be stored in secure rooms with additional guards, sensors, and cameras being available there. But besides physical security, we also need to secure our devices, our data, by adding encryption and by having multiple defense mechanisms in our networks, such as having intrusion detection system or IDS, intrusion prevention system, firewalls, and we also want to secure our endpoint devices with EDRs, anti-malware and antivirus softwares, and similar softwares that will enhance our security. Now, as you can see, there are many things that we must pay attention to when it comes to security. And here we just mentioned some of them. We will talk about all of these things in details throughout the next sections, but before we get into that, I just want to mention one more quick thing right here at the start, which are different standards, and laws when it comes to security. Now, it is important that we are aware of these standards due to them being widely applied and respected all over the world. As with everything else in this lecture, we will cover these as well in details when we come to risk management and incident response sections, but here are some of the known standards or more important standards, or safe to say laws, when it comes to security. We have GDPR, which stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and it is there to protect the personal information or personal data of a user, such as their name, surname, date of birth, their email address, photographies, and phone number. Typically, most of the basic information that almost every website requires when creating an account. Now, we also have HIPAA, or Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is for medical records. We have PCI DSS, which stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, and its name is self-explanatory. It is focused on handling and storing data regarding card payments. And we also have something that some of you may have heard of, which is FISMA, or Federal Information Security Management Act. Now, here I also wrote out each of these in case you want to write it down somewhere, since these will be important, but no worries, we will be mentioning them throughout the course again, so you will have plenty of time to remember them. Okay. This would be some of the basic stuff and basic terms that you want to know when it comes to security. Of course, there are more. This is just an introductory lesson, so let's not make it any longer and let's dive deep into our first topic, which will be authentication and access control. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. So, in the last section, we introduced ourselves with Security Plus exam information, topics that it covers, and we also touched on some basic terms and concepts in security, where we explained the CIA triangle and we gave an example of how a layered concept of defense could look like. But now let's dive into our first topic, which is authentication and access control. Once again, feel free to organize the way that you follow each topic based on how you prefer. If you don't have any special preference which topic you want to learn first, then you can simply follow along the course as we go. Okay, back to the authentication and access control. We will start with the concept of control first. So before we get to access control and account or file access controls and permissions, which are most common to hear about, let's first talk about what different types of control even are there. So we have several. These would be some of the main controls, which are technical control, administrative control, as well as operational control and physical control. Now, sometimes you might hear about only 3 of these being the main ones without physical control or without operational control, but in general, all 4 are equally important and they play a big part in security itself. Now, let's explain all of them one by one. So, technical control is control implemented by the IT team in order to lower the risk of being compromised or exploited. These would include things like having IPS or IDS, where IDS or intrusion detection system would look at the network and try to discover or identify any changes or threats, while IPS or intrusion prevention system would be there to stop attacks taking place. And we would also have things such as firewall and firewall rules, which could block unwanted traffic, both coming to the network and going out of the network. We would also have antivirus programs, which are security measures used to protect our endpoint devices and desktops. Next up, we have administrative control, which is done by the management team or the administrators, and its goal is to write the policies which will lower risk of compromise or pretty much lower any unwanted risk inside the company. There are many of these procedures that can lower the risk inside the company, and one of them is doing penetration tests regularly, which we will talk about later in the course. Next one, we have operational controls, which is done by company employees on daily basis. These include things like employee training or education every year regarding security. These trainings help employees know exactly what they should and shouldn't do. For example, inside the training, you might tell an employee that they should wear their ID cards with them, and that rule should be respected every single day, so all the employees should wear their ID badges or ID cards every time they come to work. It could also be some type of a cybersecurity training where employees are educated not to open spam emails and they're educated to recognize phishing links and attacks. Employees are also taught about business plan of continuity, or also known as BCP, which is a policy on how each employee will act in case of incident or if some type of unwanted situation occurs. This could help companies' business continue even in a case of catastrophe. Next up, we have physical control, which is self-explanatory. Now, physical security control is there to prevent unauthorized access to the company facility and its data. These types of controls could include things like wearing security badges, having gates and fences around the company building, having a visitors list. So for example, if there is a certain group of visitors coming inside your company building, you want to have someone identify them and write their names down in case anything happens, so we have a list of who entered and left the building. You want to have CCTV cameras, you want to have good lighting around the building so everything can be seen well, and for both outside and inside buildings you want to have guards that are there to protect. Now, ideally, you want to have multiple guards in case one of them gets distracted. You also want to have alarms inside the building, electronic locks, biometric locks, tokens, contactless cards, and you want to have things such as fire extinguishers in case fire breaks out. Now, these would be some of the most important things when it comes to physical control. And also, in case your company has big server rooms, for example, you want to make sure that the temperature of the room is good. So, for example, we could think about implementing heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and we also want to have fire protection implemented close to the important server rooms, so if there is some type of fire outbreak, we can put it out relatively quickly. Now, these are some of the physical security controls that are the most important, but of course there are other ones that you can include, such as, for example, having cable locks on your devices so that they can't get stolen. You could have safe or a security room where all the laptops and other devices are stored when they are not used. Now, this is not primarily to prevent the theft of the laptops themselves, but rather the data on those laptops, which could be far more important and valuable. Now, of course, besides all of this, there are some other advanced methods, such as, for example, implementing Faraday cage, which is a metal construction which can prevent wireless devices to work inside the company. Okay, so that would be physical control or physical security control. And besides these 4 types of control, it is also important that we know the term of access control. Now, concept of access control and the term itself is important for us. Its name is self-explanatory. We know what access control means. It is either preventing or granting access to someone based on certain types of rules or certain policy. Now, there are 3 main components of access control that we should be familiar with, and those are identification, authentication, and authorization. Now, identification can be considered as an individual having a smart card or having their own account, for example. Authentication is an individual authenticating their identity. This can be done by entering a password for an account or entering PIN code. And authorization is the last part, which is level of access which will be granted to an individual once he gets authenticated. This can differ from person to person depending on their position in company and their spec of work. For example, someone working in sales department will only be authorized to have access to sales group and its data. Now, here comes the term that we already covered, which is least privilege. where an individual should only have minimal access but enough to be able to do their work. Okay, so these three are important. Make sure to remember what identification is, what authentication is, and what authorization is, and what they are used for. Now, besides this, we also have different types of access control, and these would include MAC, or mandatory access control, which is based on classification of data and can be divided into top secret, secret, confidential, and restricted. The next one that we have is discretionary access control, or DAC, which is similar to least privilege concept, but in this case it refers to one user where user is given enough access to finish or do their work. Now, to fully understand this, we will take a look at an example in one of the next lectures where we cover file permissions, which is a part of the AC. So we will look at both Windows and Linux file access control or file permissions, and we will explain them in detail. Okay, besides this, we also have rule-based access control, which are different set of rules aimed towards employees. This can be different for individuals working in separate departments. For example, the sales team will have access in the morning hours while financial team will have access in the afternoon. These rules can be based on other things as well and don't have to just be based on time. Now, another type of access control that I just want to mention is role-based access control, which are a set of rules that are based for an individual role, and sometimes you can find it confusing since both rule-based access control and role-based access control have same short identification of RBAC. Just make sure that you remember both of them, so there is rule-based and role-based access control. Now, besides these two, we also have attribute-based access control. And attribute-based access control is an authorization model that evaluates attributes or characteristics rather than roles, which are then used to determine the access of an individual. And last but not least, we have group-based access control, where you group individuals from, let's say, IT department and give them access to the IT data that they need. You would first make a list of all the people from IT department, form a group with all of them, and then grant access to that group to certain data that the group works with. Here is an example of how a group-based access control would look like. So we have two different people that both need access to same type of data. We can create group, we can add everyone that needs access to this type of data to that group and then grant that data to the group itself, rather to each person or each employee individually. Now, besides the current controls that we already mentioned, let's also mention a few more which you should be familiar with, and those are preventive controls, corrective controls, and compensating controls. One thing to note is that these are all types of controls, and if certain rule applies to one type of control, it doesn't mean it can't be a part of a different type of control as well. A certain policy, rule, or control can be a part of many of the current types of control that we discussed in this lecture. So let's define each of these one by one. Preventive controls attempt to prevent security incidents. Now, for example, system hardening or user training can be an example of this. On the other hand, corrective controls attempt to reverse the impact of an incident or a problem after it has occurred. And compensating controls are controls which are alternative, and they are used when it is not possible to use the primary controls. For example, let's say an employee should authenticate via smart card as a primary method or primary control, but he hasn't received his smart card yet since he is a new employee and he got hired yesterday. We could use compensating controls such as perhaps authenticating via password instead until they get their new ID card or smart card. Okay, so that would be about it when it comes to different groups or different types of control. Quite a long video, right? Well, no worries. By going over these different types of control and different types of access control 2 or 3 times, you should remember the most important thing, and that is what they're mostly focused on. You should remember each of them and their basic definitions. The good thing is that for many of them, their name is self-explanatory, such as, for example, mentioning, let's say, physical security control. Even without going over the video again, you can think of what exactly that would be, right? Well, nonetheless, let's not make the video any longer, and let's get straight into the next lecture, where we will talk about identity and different types of identity. See you in the next lecture. Okay, let's quickly go over the identification and different types of identity that can occur in the real world. So, we already mentioned the 3 core steps of access control, which are identification, authentication, and authorization. But there is one more which we didn't mention, which is accounting. Now, when employees or users connect or log in or authenticate on the network, usually inside the companies there will be files that are keeping the logs of these events. Accounting is just a process of maintaining these event log files. It means keeping an eye on users' activity and data that they have access to while they're on the company's network. These 4 steps or 4 elements are a part of identity and access management. Now, when it comes to identity, there is an entity called IDP or Identity Provider. Identity Provider or IDP is someone or a service who can confirm and verify the correct identity of users. There are different types of identity or factors that can be used to identify someone. Let's mention some of them. The most common one we encounter is username. Now, username is the name of the account given to an individual and that is used to identify them. We also have attribute or attributes, which is something that the user has or that was given to him, such as, for example, the employee ID, which also can be used to identify the user. There are also other things that can be used, such as smart cards, certificates or digital certificates, which can generate 2 keys, a public key and a private key, and the private key would be used for identity. We have digital tokens, which can be used with open authentication or can be used for federation service, which we will talk about later in the section. And there are also things such as SSH keys, which are used for secure authentication on a device, which can be far away. It works as well with the public and private key, where public key is on the server while private key is stored in the endpoint device, which is used by the administrator to connect to that server. Now, here is a command that you could use to generate the RSA public and private key, which you would then copy the public key to the server and add it to the list of authorized users. Now, speaking of public keys and private keys can also be used for identification. We already mentioned that in multiple examples, starting with SSH keys and also with the certificates, but private keys on their own are identifiers since they can be used to identify someone or a device. You can generate a private key on Linux with the help of command openSSL gen rsa-out rsa.private, and then you provide the length of the key. And these commands are not really necessary to remember for the exam, but it's good to have them in the back of your mind so you can use them whenever you want, when the need occurs. Okay, these would be common ways used for identification. Things like usage of usernames, smart cards, tokens is quite common today in companies, so knowing these concepts will be useful for both the exam and for real world. Okay, now that we know about identity and different ways of identification, let's talk about account access control and accounts in general. So we already know which types of access controls are most common, right? We talked about mandatory access control, discretionary access control, role-based and rule-based access control, attribute-based access control, and group-based access control. Many times, these access controls will be aimed at accounts that are being ran by individual employees inside of a company. So to make things more organized, besides just implementing different access controls to these accounts, we should also identify types of accounts. For example, an administrator and an employee will not usually have same type of the account. And besides that, when a new user joins the company and company's network, they will have their own username, but besides the username, each account or each user will also have an SID or security identifier. An SID can look something like this, where we have the username on the left and we have something that could be an SID number on the right. This allows that in case a user registers with same name or tries to register with the same username, they will still have different SIDs, essentially making both of the accounts or both of them unique. This can also prevent an account accessing another account's data just because they have the same username. But as we mentioned, besides just having an SID as an identificator for an account, we also have different account groups. We have a user account, which in general has standard access, which means they have enough access to perform their tasks. Generally, these accounts will not be able to install or modify softwares on the system since their access is limited. There are two main types of user accounts: the one that belongs to the domain, and a local user account for the device that's being used. Besides user accounts, we have administrator account. Now, admin accounts can usually configure and manage different servers and endpoint devices, as well as install needed software and modify that software. You also have elevated privileges compared to a user account, so you can create or delete different user accounts with administrator privileges. Now, since administrator account has elevated privileges, it is considered a higher security risk if it gets compromised. That is why it is a good practice that an administrator has both admin account and user account, which they can use whenever administrator account is not necessary. Now, administrator accounts are also a group of so-called privileged accounts, since privileged accounts by definition have more access than a standard user account. We also have a service account, which is a type of administrator account which is generally used for running applications or software, since running softwares is typically a privileged task, therefore requiring elevated privileges. Service account is used for that. We also have something called guest account. Now, guest account is rarely being used anymore. However, the goal of guest account is to allow access on a device without the need to create a user account. As I mentioned, this is not being used a lot anymore, and it is considered to pose a security risk. Now, a sponsored guest account is a different thing, since it is used when someone who perhaps is not a part of company is required to perform some tasks inside the network, or is perhaps giving a speech or holding a presentation which requires network access. For this type of individuals, usually a sponsored guest account is created by the IT team, which after the job is done, the account is deactivated or disabled. Next up, we got shared account. Now, shared account is usually not a good practice if it is not necessary. Shared account allows multiple users who need to perform same task to use a shared account which is used for that specific task. However, this limits the possibility to track each user and their activity. For example, if multiple users use the same account and someone makes an error, you won't be able to identify who caused this error without additional parameters, since more than one person can get access to that account. And last but not least, we have generic accounts. Now, generic accounts are usually found in a wide range of devices, from Internet of Things devices to network components, where the manufacturer sets up an administrator account or so-called generic account for that device, with its credentials in order to modify settings or add functionality to that device. Now, security risk that is typically found with these type of accounts is that in many cases they are left with default username and default password, which if you do not change can be an easy target for an attacker to gain access. Now that we covered different account types, let me also introduce you to a term that you might or might not encounter on the Security Plus exam, which is Privileged Access Management, or PAM. Now, Privileged Access Management consists of the cybersecurity strategies and technologies for exerting control over the elevated access and permissions for users, accounts, processes, and systems across entire IT environment. It is a solution that can prevent certain attacks such as privilege escalation and pass the hash attacks. It works by separating unprivileged accounts and administrator accounts where in between there will be high level of security, also referred to as PAN trust. The administrator's account are set to just enough administration, which is pretty much the least privileged concept just for privileged accounts, where administrators will be given just enough privilege to finish a certain task. Alright, by now we have covered different types of control, different types of access control, different types of accounts, and their possible security risks, and we mentioned the concept of privileged access management. In the next video, let's take a look at the practical example of file access control in both Windows and Linux system. Alright, file access control. This is something that you should know even if it doesn't come on the exam, because it might be important for something else that you encounter in the future. So file access controls can be considered a part of discretionary access control, since DAC is the principle of restricting access to objects based on the identity of the subject. Inside Windows systems, there are a few things that we will encounter when checking the permissions of a file. There are full control, modify, which is modifying the data, reading and executing, and read and execute is what allows someone to read a file and start a program if the file is executable. Then we have just read, which is simply just reading the file. We have write, which is writing to the file, and we have special permissions, which allows access to details of permissions, which you can access to by clicking on button advanced once you're in the file properties, which we will check in just a second. Under the details, you will also be able to check who the owner of the file is. But before we look at an example of this, let's also mention Linux file access controls or file permissions. Now, when it comes to Linux, it's a little bit different. Permissions are given in numerical format, and it goes like this. The permissions will consist of 3 numbers, where first number will be the owner and their permission. The second number will be the group's permission, and the third number will be the permissions of all the other users. And the numbers that we will see at each of these 3 locations will be the sum of permissions that either owner, group, or other users have. Now, let me explain this a little bit more, since I know that it might be confusing if you encounter this for the first time. So, number 4 will be equal to reading. 2 will be equal to writing, and 1 will be equal to executing a file. So, for example, if a file has permissions of 764, that means that the owner has permissions for all 3, so for reading, writing, and executing, since the sum of all 3 is equal to 7, because 4 plus 2 plus 1 is equal to 7. Group has number 6, which means they only have access to reading and writing, since sum of reading and writing is 6. This means that they do not have the permission to execute the file. And other users have access to only reading, since the third number, which is other users' permissions, is equal to 4, which is simply just reading. It can be writing because writing is 2, and it can be executing because executing is 1. Another way in Linux as to how file permissions can be set is with letters which are R, W, and X, which mean read, write, and execute. The concept of looking at permissions is similar, where first 3 letter spots will say the owner permissions, second 3 spots will be the group's permissions, and last 3 spots will be the other user permissions. Now, let's take a look at how exactly this looks like in both Windows and Linux systems. Okay, so here I am on my Ubuntu Linux system, and let's take a look at a quick example how file permissions look like here. So I'll open terminal, which is just a command line window where I can execute commands, and I'm currently in the desktop directory where I'm going to create a simple txt file. So I created test.txt, and here it is down here on the desktop. Now to check the permissions of all the files, I can simply just type ls-l, which will list the files in the current directory, and here we will have the permissions. So they're written in a format of letters. R stands for read, W stands for write, and since this file does not have execute permissions, we cannot see the letter X, which would be in the place of these dashes right here. So for example, if I wanted to make it an executable, I can use this command, so chmod +x and then the file name. Wait, I need space. So test.txt. Now the file has execute permissions, which we can check by typing ls-l. Now we have read, write, execute, read, write, execute. Cool, right? So this would be an example of how you can check the permissions on a Linux system with the help of terminal. Now let's take a look at how it looks like in Windows systems. So I already have the same file created right here, which is the test.txt file on my Windows desktop, and once you right click and go to properties, it will open this window right here. If we go to security, under the security we will see permissions for the system, where we will see the permissions that we talked about in the presentation. So here we can see what is allowed, what is denied, and if we want to change any of these, we can go to advanced settings, which also offers special permissions that we covered. Nonetheless, this would be a simple example of how to check file permissions in both Windows and Linux. So the practical way of checking it will not really be on your exam. All you need to do is remember the theory behind it. So you need to remember how permissions look like on Linux, as well as how permissions look like on Windows, and what are the permissions called. Okay, awesome. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture. Alright, let's focus a little bit on authentication. So we already encountered the AAA protocol, and by now we should already be familiar with what AAA stands for. It stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. There are 2 main types of AAA servers, which are radius or remote authentication dial-in user servers, and we have TACX+, which stands for Terminal Access Controller Access Control System Plus. Whoa, quite a long definition for TACX, right? Anyway, when it comes to radius, it is important that we differentiate the radius server and the radius client. The radius server is based on UDP, and it is used to authenticate servers such as virtual private network servers, also known as VPNs, remote access service or RAS, and switches for 802.1x authentication. Let's quickly mention the use of VPN. So VPN or Virtual Private Network allows someone to connect remotely and securely over the internet to the company's network, basically from anywhere. Now VPN compared to remote access service is a much better option, and remote access service or RAS was used before VPN. Some of the authentication methods used by remote access service and virtual private networks are PAP or Password Authentication Protocol, CHAP or Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, and we got Microsoft CHAP, which is Microsoft Handshake Authentication Protocol, which also now has a version 2. Okay, now when it comes to remote access servers, VPN servers, 802.1x switches for authentication, each of these are also known and considered to be Radius clients, right? Now, it might be confusing a little bit since each of these are also servers on their own, but they are considered Radius clients when Radius is used. Inside your company, you could set up a remote access service and add Radius server with it, which would be used to then check for proper authentication on the remote access service. Now, one thing to note, which you might or might not encounter on the exam, but you should know just in case, is that the Radius client needs to have its private key, or also known as session key, in order to be valid. Also, Radius authentication is done over port 1812, and the Radius encrypts usually just the password, while the rest of the communication or the rest of information is unencrypted. We already mentioned that it is using a UDP port, and we gave the port number 1812. And it's also important to know that there is a modern version of Radius which is called Diameter. Now, Diameter is different because Diameter works over TCP instead of UDP. Diameter uses EAP, which is Authentication Protocol, or it's also known as Extensible Authentication Protocol, and this could be on your exam, so make sure that you know this, as well as knowing the difference between Radius and Diameter. So Radius is using UDP, while Diameter is using TCP. Now, at the beginning, we also mentioned TACACS, which is Cisco's AAA server, which also uses TCP, same as Diameter, and works over port 49. Now, it's also important to know that TACACS, compared to Radius, encrypts entire session, while Radius only encrypts the password. Okay, before we close off this lecture, let me just touch on EAP a bit here before we end the video. Now, we mentioned that EAP is used by Diameter and that it is an extensible authentication protocol. The Extensible Authentication Protocol is an architectural framework that provides extensibility for authentication methods for commonly used protected network access technologies such as 802.1x based wireless access, 802.1x based wired access, and point-to-point protocol connections such as, for example, VPN. Now, Extensible Authentication Protocol is not an authentication method like MS-CHAP version 2, which we talked about, but it is rather a framework on the access client and authentication server that allows networking vendors to develop and easily install new authentication methods known as EAP methods. Now, there are different types of EAP, which we listed right here. So we have PEAP. Now, this protected extensible authentication protocol only needs a certificate that is installed on the server, and it puts EAP data inside of TLS tunnel. Next up, we got EAP Fast, or also known as flexible authentication via secure tunneling. It is used in wireless networks, and it doesn't use certificate for access, but rather protected identifiers. Now, EAP TLS is using X509 certificates, which are on the endpoint devices and are used for authentication. And we have EAP TTLS, which is similar to EAP TLS, but the main difference is that EAP TLS requires both client and server to identify themselves with a certificate, while EAP TTLS only requires server to have the certificate. Okay, now I know many of the things that we talked about right here are probably new to you, so this is, for example, one of the lectures where you might want to research a little bit on the side to fully grasp on this project. So you can just research a little bit about Radius, you can search up TACACS, Diameter, and you can see what are the different capabilities and functionalities of all of these three servers that we covered. And you also could if you want, research a little bit more about EAP or Extensible Authentication Protocol. Nonetheless, we're not going to make this any longer. You can also take a look at the more detailed definitions of each of these in our resource file. As we mentioned before, you want to follow that resource file because it does contain useful information there, which you can use to follow along with the lectures. Okay, that would be about it, and let's move on to the next lecture. Welcome back. So, in the previous lecture, we talked about the AAA protocol and main AAA servers, their differences, and what they are used for, and we also talked a little bit about EAP and different types of EAP. Now let's talk about different types of authentication and authentication management. So, when it comes to different types of authentication, we have several of them. We will be mentioning the ones that are important for the course and for the exam. So first up, we have token-based authentication. So there are several types of token-based authentication, but commonly used one is time-based one-time password, or also known as TOTP. This one-time password is usually used in a short period which lasts about 30 to 60 seconds, and the typical usage of TOTP is with your bank when, for example, the transaction is larger. So besides the 3-digit number that you enter from your card when buying something online, you might also be required to provide a one-time password which can be generated usually from your bank's application. Another type of token authentication is based on HMAC, or also known as HOTP. These two are quite similar, except in HOTP, the token does not have time limit, however it can only be used once, so once you use it, you cannot use the same token again afterwards. Next up, we have certificate-based authentication. Now, different types of certificate-based authentication could include things like smart cards, which we already mentioned before. These smart cards have certificates embedded in the chip part of the card. And besides the smart cards, we also have a similar version such as Common Access Card or CAC. These cards are typically used in military environments where on the card there will be a picture of the person whose card it is and some other information that will closely identify that person. Now, another type of authentication that we should know is port-based authentication. For this, usually 802.1x protocol is used for authentication when the device is connected to switch or when the device wants to connect to the wireless access point. Next one that we have is location-based authentication, and location is often used as a part of authentication. You probably encountered it multiple times when logging into one of your accounts from a different country when, for example, you're traveling. You might have received an email notifying you that your account was accessed from a new or from a different location, and it probably even required additional identification or additional authentication factor to let you fully log in. In location-based authentication, we have things such as context-aware location, which can be used to block access or login attempts from any location that is not mentioned as allowed location. Usually your location will be determined by your IP address. We also have smartphone location services, which is used to find the location of your mobile device with the help of GPS, which is Global Positioning System. Now, turning on location service settings on your device allows this to happen. Okay, now also when it comes to location-based authentication, there are certain security functions such as impossible travel time, which is typically used by cloud providers to block login attempts that are simply impossible to perform. For example, let's say you logged in from France 30 minutes ago, and now 30 minutes later, you're trying to log in from Canada. Now, since this is not physically possible, your attempt to log in will be blocked. Another security feature is called risky login, which is also used by cloud providers. It works by having a database of all the devices that you're using to log in. Once a login from a new device is detected, you will be notified about that attempt and you will most likely need to confirm that device somewhere, usually over your email that's connected to the account, in order to proceed with the login. Now, besides getting an email, there are also different types of ways of authenticating, and we have listed some here. So some typical authentication ways include SMS authentication, tokens, push notifications, which is typically emails being sent when there are some irregularities with your logins, whether that being different location or different device. We also have phone calls, which are another way to authenticate someone. We got static codes, and we have more advanced ways through mechanisms such as Kerberos and JavaScript Object Notation Web Token, or JWT. We will explain more advanced existing authentications or authentication mechanisms in the next lecture. Now, another important term that you have probably heard of before is multi-factor authentication. This is using multiple ways of authentication, which increases security. The more ways of authentication that are being used will most likely result in better security. These factors of authentication are typically grouped in different types, which are something that you know, which can be your username and password or things like date of birth. Then we have something that you have. So for example, it could be a smart card or a credit card. It could also be things like a hardware token. Then we have something that you are, which is typically biometric authentication, which we will also talk about later in the next lecture. For example, your fingerprint is an example of something that you are and is an example of biometric authentication. Besides this, we have also something that you do, which can be an action such as, for example, swiping your card or signing with your signature. It can also be things like how you walk or how you move, or pretty much any action that can be used to authenticate or identify you. And last that we have is somewhere where you're at. This would be your location. Now that we know these 5 things, it is important that we know the difference between one-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, or multiple-factor authentication. So to define all 3 of these, we need to refer to the previous slide. So if you have multiple things from one group that we previously mentioned, that would be a one-factor authentication. Let's say you have username, password, and static PIN that doesn't change. That is all part of something that you know, making it one-factor authentication. Now, if you, for example, have a password and a token or a smart card, and you use both of them to authenticate, well, then that is two-factor authentication, since here we use something that we know and something that we have. And typically when smart card is involved, we also need to perform some type of an action with it, which can be swiping that card, which would make it a multi-factor authentication if used with, let's say, username and password. This is because username and password is something that we know, smart card is something that we have, and swiping the card is something that we do. Okay, so that would be the concept of multi-factor authentication, and make sure to know this because they might occur on the exam. Now, before we close off this lecture, I want to briefly talk about authentication management. Now, authentication management is also something that can occur on the exam, including all the previous things mentioned in this lecture. So it is important that we are familiar with all of the concepts, right? So let's explain it here. There are different types of managing authentication, and here is a list of all of them. We have password keys. Now, password keys is a device that works with a combination of your password in order to create multi-factor authentication. We have password vaults. Now, password vault is usually stored on your local device and is used to protect all of your passwords. It is protected by the master password that you know, so as long as the master password is strong, the password vault is strong as well. These vaults typically use AES 256 encryption. We also have things like TPM or Trusted Platform Module. These are chips that are located on your motherboard usually and use cryptography to help securely store essential and critical information on PCs to enable platform authentication. They store a variety of sensitive information such as user credentials, passwords, fingerprints, certificates, encryption keys, or other important consumer documentation. Now, typically, it is the encryption keys that they store, and these encryption keys are usually used for full disk encryption. The next one that we have is HSM, or Hardware Security Module. It can also be used for storing encryption keys, but the difference is that this device can also be portable and transmitted. It can be connected to a device via USB. Next up, we have things such as static KBA, or knowledge-based authentication, and dynamic knowledge-based authentication. Now, static knowledge-based authentication is what you probably encountered, and it is when a website asks you what is the name of your first pet, for example. Usually you encounter this when you try to change your password, so it asks for additional security measures such as these types of questions that you provided once you created an account. Now, on the other hand, dynamic knowledge-based authentication, which is more secure because the questions are generated at the point or at the moment, and this is typically seen in banks when you try to authenticate. They might ask you for things such as your name, surname, email address, your last payment, last numbers of your card, and similar things. Okay, so that would be it regarding the authentication management. Now, everything that we covered in this lecture can occur on your exam. This includes authentication management, multi-factor authentication, and different types of authentication that we covered at the beginning of the lecture. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to continue with different types of authentication, but we're going to mostly touch on already existing authentication and authorization mechanisms that are used in the real world. See you in the next lecture. Alright, let's wrap up with authorization and authentication. We already talked about authentication management, multi-factor authentication, and we also mentioned a few types of authentication. Now let's continue by talking about types of authentication typically seen in the real world, especially in corporative surroundings. So let's start off with the concept of Active Directory first. Most companies nowadays have Active Directories, and it is useful because it has a users or employees database, and it has certain protocols and measures taking place which allow us to more easily authenticate everyone. Now, when we talk about Active Directory, we should mention the Microsoft's Active Directory, which has implemented a protocol called LDAP, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, I usually like to simplify things, so the definition of LDAP, which is the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, is an open, vendor-neutral, industry-standard application protocol for accessing and maintaining distributed directory information services over a network. I think we can, in this context, say that LDAP is simply used to manage users or employees in certain groups on the network. So, how does it all work exactly? Well, the directory itself is used to store and protect objects such as, for example, users or employees, their machines and devices, while the devices can be interpreted as X500 objects. Okay, follow me for a moment here, as it will all make sense at the end. So these objects are being organized and kept by LDAP, and they typically have three different values. These values are domain, organizational unit, and common name, which is everything else that could define an object. So an example could be something like this. The CN would, let's say, be user 1, the organizational unit would be, let's say, finances, and domain would be two separate values, which are, let's say, domain A and com or .com. We already mentioned that to filter or search for these objects, we use LDAP. But it is also important to mention that there is a secure version of LDAP, which is LDAP Secure. But in general, you want to remember that LDAP is used for searching objects in Active Directory, and that there is a secure version, which is Lightweight Directory Access Protocol Secure. And you also want to know what we mentioned, and that is which object values are there and what is assigned to organizational unit, what is assigned to domain, and what is assigned to common name. Now, an important authentication mechanism or protocol used that we should know is Kerberos. Kerberos uses updated sequence number tickets, and the process of getting the service ticket is called the TGT session, or Ticket Granting Ticket Session. Now, for Kerberos authentication to be successful, the time on each device has to be synchronized. If it is not synchronized, the authentication might fail. A common use to make all devices synchronized with time is the implementation and usage of NTP, or Network Time Protocol. Now, the basic concept behind Kerberos is that the user sends their identifiers, such as their PIN, username, or password, to the domain controller, which then initiates the process of authentication, and once the identity is confirmed, then it sends back the service ticket, which lasts by default 10 hours. This would be a rather simplified explanation, but I doubt you will be required to know more for the Security Plus exam. Another concept in Kerberos that we want to mention is single sign-on, or also known as mutual authentication. Here the user exchanges or sends their service ticket to get the session ticket, which is then used to access resources. Okay, besides this, we also want to know what NTLM is for the exam. NTLM, or NT-LAN Manager, is old protocol which was used for authentication before Kerberos, and it used to store passwords with MD4 hashes which are easy to break. It was vulnerable to pass the hash attacks, brute force attacks, and man-in-the-middle attacks. Now, another mechanism that we have is transitive trust. Transitive trust is a two-way relationship automatically created between parent and child domains in a Microsoft Active Directory forest. When a new domain is created, it shares resources with its parent domain by default, enabling an authenticated user to access resources in both the child and the parent. So if we have three different domains, A, B, and C, and since C trusts both A and B because they are the child domains, then we can say there is transitive trust between A and B as well. Okay. Next up, we have Federation Services. Now, Federation Services builds upon this functionality to authenticate users on third-party systems, such as another company's extranet or a service hosted by a cloud provider. In other words, Federation Services is used when two companies want to authenticate one another. If you encounter on exam a question regarding third-party authentication, it is usually referred to Federation Services. And to explain the concept, let's say we have two domains with different users inside of it, and for one user of domain number 2 to access domain number 1, they would need an account. Now, since they don't have an account in each other's domain, once these two companies agree to Federation Services, the users start using something called user extended attributes or secondary credentials to access other companies' domain. These user extended attributes are usually email addresses or the ID of the employee, and they are appended or added to the normal attributes that the employees have. Once again, if you encounter a question regarding user extended attributes, it will most likely refer to Federation Services. When two companies need to exchange user extended attributes information, they usually use SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language. An example of Federation Services that use SAML authentication is Shibboleth. Now, another concept of authentication you might hear about and encounter is single sign-on or SSO. Now, single sign-on is an authentication method that enables users to securely authenticate with multiple applications and websites by using just one set of credentials. It is typically encountered from inside a domain where multiple applications trust one another. Now, Kerberos as well as Federation services are an example of when SSO can be used, since you authenticate once and then have access to all the resources that you need. Next up, we have internet-based open source authentication. Now, sometimes different companies that host applications don't want to be responsible for creation and account management. For this to work, these companies use OAuth 2.0. Now, an example of this you have encountered many times probably. So, for example, how many times you went on a certain website and they offered multiple options for sign up where you did not need to create an account but rather log in via, let's say, Google or Facebook or Twitter. This is done by using OpenID Connect. You go on a certain website where you must log in, they offer an option to do it with Google, you click on sign in with Google, which then loads up Google login page where you authenticate and then you are brought back to the original website. Okay, I know we covered quite a lot in this video, but stick with me for just a little more. Next one is interesting mechanism. We have biometrics. Biometric authentication is a security process that relies on the unique biological characteristics of individuals to verify that they are who they say they are. Certain examples of biometric authentication include fingerprint, iris scanners, handwriting recognition, facial recognition, voice recognition, and there are many more besides these. What's important for us for the exam is to know the biometric mistakes. So we have false acceptance rate, or FAR, and we have false rejection rate, or FRR. Now, FAR is when the system grants access to unauthorized users, and this is known as type 2 error, while FRR, or false rejection rate, is when the legitimate users or employees are denied access, and this is considered a type 1 error. Make sure to remember these as they can occur on the exam, and we have two more terms that are important regarding the false acceptance rate and false rejection rate, and one of them is crossover error rate, or CER. This is a point on graph where false acceptance rate and false rejection rate are equal, and when you're, for example, buying a biometric system, you ideally want to have as low crossover error rate as possible. This can also be referred to as efficacy rate, so when you're looking at a certain biometric system, you want this to be low, since if the crossover error rate is lower, that means that there are less possible errors. And last but not least, let's talk about mechanisms in cloud. The reason we specifically mention cloud is because when you do not use cloud and have your own devices, your own servers, then you have full control over it and you can put certain protections such as having high fences around the building, having guards, implementing a bunch of security softwares to protect the networks, and adding any type of security policy and authentication, which we talked about previously. But when it comes to cloud, you no longer have that control. And not only that, but the field of threats increases. This is why in cloud we should have something called zero trust model. Here we do not trust any signal or any connection coming to the cloud, and we consider all of them as possible threats. We then put certain conditions on who we allow and who we do not allow. The graph would look something like this. So we have a connection, initiation, or so-called signal, which has its own attributes such as IP, which device is being used, from where is the signal coming from, and considering those basic attributes or information for the signal, we determine if we will block the access, grant the access, or require additional information such as extra PIN or security question, or whatever additional security authentication measure that we have. You might have encountered something like this when you logged into a certain website with a new device. You were most likely notified and asked for email confirmation or additional code to authenticate. This part is so-called decision. And last part, if access is granted, is called enforcement, where the user can access the resources or application. Alright, this is probably one of the longer videos, if not the longest video in the course, but we got through all of the existing common authentication and authorization mechanisms that are important for the exam. Nonetheless, in the next lecture, we will wrap up this section by talking about certain account control policies that companies might implement. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. So we talked about access control, different types of accounts, and different ways of authentication and authorization. But now let's talk about certain policies or practices that are common to see in corporations. So, a few things that are important that we should mention. And we will start with account creation. So, whenever a new employee gets a job in a certain company, they must have an account, right? This account would be used for the employee to access all the resources that they need for the work, but that's not the only purpose of an account. It is also used for easier identification by the administrators. Everyone should have a unique account, but those accounts should also be easy to manage. That's why in big companies there are naming policies, so you cannot have any username that you want, but you rather need to follow a naming policy. So for example, Michael Johnson could have a username of m.johnson. If there was no naming policies, well then anyone could name their account whatever they want, and you wouldn't be able to control or manage the accounts. Another important account control practice is disabling accounts. Now, there are multiple reasons as to why an account should be disabled or deactivated. Most common one would be if employee is leaving the company. Their account should be deactivated and closed so that the employee cannot access company resources after leaving the company. Now, here you want to be careful as you usually do not want to fully delete the account right after the employee leaves the company. You just want to make sure that they cannot access it. This is done by either disabling the account or changing the password to the account so that you still have the data regarding that account in case you need it for whatever reason, but the employee does not have access anymore. There is also practice when an employee changes the department so you can create a new account for him and deactivate an old one. Now in a company sometimes there will be a need for reconfirmation of the account or also called account audits, and this is done in case something is wrong with the account. So periodically all of the accounts will be inspected for any type of policy violation or if there is any rule that they do not follow. If an account is found to not follow a certain policy, then the person who's inspecting the account might report it to the management team, who will then look into it and propose a different policy. Periodically monitoring account is an important part of account maintenance since all the policies should be followed, starting from naming conventions to password policies to deactivating accounts when employees leave the company. These are all part of account monitoring practices, and usually this is done by having SIM system activated. Now, SIM stands for Security Information and Event Management System. It is used for monitoring in real time, and this monitoring is done with a set of filters which can be used for many different purposes when set properly. We can use them for account management, account expiration, so for example we can put a time frame on the account itself. An example would include if certain job lasts for 1 week, let's say, then we can set 1 week time frame for that account so that it expires when the job is finished. We can also put locks on certain accounts based on which shift they work in. So for example, if let's say finance department is active from 8 in the morning to 2 o'clock afternoon, then we can put locks so that the accounts are not usable outside that time frame. We also want to lock accounts due to other security threats such as brute force attacks. For example, an employee should be given between 3 to 5 attempts to enter a password, and if they fail, an account should be locked and inspected. As we mentioned before, accounts should periodically be inspected so that if certain policy is not followed, we can act upon it, or inspection can also be done to check if an account that should be closed is still being used. Now, perhaps most important policies should be regarding passwords, right? If password is weak or non-existent, well then no other security measure is going to protect you. We must have strong password. So let's mention a couple of password policies, and we will start off with administrator's password. Now you might notice this even if you use Windows systems. You use a regular account of yours and only use administrator account once you need to elevate permissions for a certain program or software installation. Same applies to administrators in the network or in a company. They should have a regular account for regular work and an administrator account for any elevated privileges that a certain task might require, and administrator account should only be used then and only then. The password, however, should be different for these two accounts, even if the same person is using them. This prevents someone who gets access to the regular user account to also log into the administrator account with the same password. It's also important to mention that default administrator passwords on either accounts or network devices must be changed. This is a common threat that occurs where default administrator passwords, usually for Internet of Things devices or routers, are not changed. Okay, now when it comes to group password policy, here are some important rules or procedures that we must be familiar with and that we should follow. Why is it important to follow this? Well, if a company, let's say, has 1,000 employees, you want to have rules that everyone will follow, because if you don't, you can be sure that at least one of those employees will have a weak password and present a security threat to the entire company. When you have rules set, this forces everyone to follow them and have a strong password. So let's go through these rules. We have enforce password history, which is there to prevent someone from reusing the password. This policy is also called password reuse, so remember that these two are the same. Usually password history blocks usage of same password for 24 password changes. Now, in simpler terms, this means that if I use a password, I will have to change my password to a different one 24 times to be able to go back to the first password that I used. After that, we have password complexity or usage of complex password. This means that our password should include small letters, capital letters, numbers, and special characters. We also want to enforce longer passwords, so typically online you will see minimal password length to be 8 characters. Besides this, we have minimum password age policy, which is a policy used to prevent an employee to change password, let's say 50 times a day. This is direct measure against password reuse so that the employee doesn't change password a bunch of times till they get to the try which allows them to use the original or first password that they had. Another term that we should be familiar with is maximum password age. And this is how long a password should be used before a change is required. This is usually set between 30 to 90 days depending on how strict the security policy is. Besides these mentioned here, we also have some other rules, such as, for example, storing passwords using reversible encryption, and this is something that we should avoid if possible because it allows passwords to be stored in Active Directory in plain text, which is highly insecure, but sometimes needed to grant access to certain applications, which are usually or typically older applications. We also have account lockout threshold. We already mentioned this group rule. It is how many tries does a user get to provide valid credentials before their account gets locked. For stricter security, this is usually set to 3 attempts. Once the account is locked, you cannot even attempt to log in anymore or provide credentials. Next up, we have account lockout duration, and this is how long will account be locked if wrong credentials are provided multiple times. Now, best practices would be to lock the account fully and to require the person to contact the administrator in order to unlock the account. We should also mention the forgotten password policy, which is when a user forgets their password but is allowed to change it. This should be done by requiring some additional personal information from the users, such as providing additional PIN or code sent to the phone number connected to the account or to the email that is connected to the account. And for the exam, it is important to remember that usage of same passwords or same credentials for two different accounts is a security threat. Alright, so that would be about it when it comes to authentication, authorization, and access control. In the next lecture, we will have a few questions regarding this entire section, and just a quick reminder, do not limit yourself just to this course. Feel free to research these topics that we covered somewhere else, as learning from different sources is the key to fully understanding these concepts. Anyway, let's wrap up this section and let's get straight into the next section where we will talk about secure network architecture and securing network devices. See you in the next lecture.